Hi, my name is Jay Sugarman, and I want to welcome you to Innovation Showcase. The main purpose of this ongoing series is to inform viewers about exciting innovations and creative individuals across the fields of business, science, technology, education, and the arts. Today, via Zoom, we're fortunate to have as our guest Dr. Beronda Montgomery. Dr. Montgomery is a very distinguished and highly accomplished biochemist, plant scientist, and writer who is spending this year as a Radcliffe Fellow at Harvard University. She's also the author of the fascinating new book entitled When Trees Testify: Science, Wisdom, History, and America's Black Botanical Legacy. The book traces the stories of specific trees and plants, revealing how they intertwined with Black history in America and with broader questions of belonging, resilience, and interdependence. By weaving together science, personal reflection, and cultural history, Dr. Montgomery asks us to reconsider how memory is held not only in archives and monuments, but in the natural world around us. Let's start by meeting Dr. Montgomery and then finding out all about When Trees Testify: Science, Wisdom, History, and America's Black Botanical Legacy. Welcome. So delighted to be able to be here.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure and honor to be in conversation with you today.
And again, congratulations on the outstanding book. I found it extremely engaging the way you wove scientific information, the storytelling nature, so informative, eager to find out more and have you inform viewers. But before we jump right to that, I think it would be of interest if you'd share a little bit more, perhaps about your background, academic, professional interest, and possibly what you're doing this year as a Radcliffe Fellow.
Yeah, so I have been a science professor for longer than I care to admit now. It's almost 3 decades. But I really led into this career after studying biology as an undergrad. I thought I was going to be a biology patent lawyer, but then
Hmm.
started to do some experimentation in the lab and realized that there was a career path by which I could just pursue my curiosities and work with young people and other scientists. And so it eventually led to becoming a professor. And as I was thinking about the area, I took classes in many different areas of biology, did experimentation in different areas, and I had a plant physiology class where the professor was so enthusiastic about plants and really made them come to life for me in a way that I had thought they were just kind of sitting there, not that exciting. So it started with an enthusiastic professor, which also gave me a desire to want to become a professor and have that opportunity to connect with enthusiasm with students. Ultimately, I started to study a specific area in plants where for 30 years I've been interested in how plants use light cues. Just kind of to tell them where they are in space and time, where they are physically in space and time, whether they're with others or not, but also they can use those cues to tell them what time of year it is and then how they use that information to go about the appropriate behaviors. So I've been studying that and learning a lot about plants, but really coming from a family that has no scientists, thought a lot about how do I share that knowledge back with them. And part of that came through just trying to make plant science accessible through storytelling, which is the way my
Hmm.
family engages, but also to ask what I was learning from the plants. And so it kind of started there. And then you talked
Wow.
about Radcliffe. This year
Yeah.
I am at the Harvard Radcliffe Institute, which I tell anybody who asks is just like Disneyland for scientists and academicians and nerds, and a class of people ranging from artists to other
Hmm.
writers and academicians, and then embedded in Cambridge where there's something to do almost every day. And so I'm just really having a great time here this year.
That's fabulous. It sounds like people's reflections on going to college, in that it's
Yes,
not only the institute, but even more so maybe your students, the colleagues, the people you meet
yes.
that make it even that much more of an enriching experience.
Absolutely. I've really enjoyed learning new things and meeting new people this year.
Wonderful, wonderful. Moving on to the book, what inspired you to get around to writing, motivated to write When Trees Testify?
Yeah, after I wrote my first book, Lessons from Plants, which was really more focused on trying to make the plant science that I had been fascinated with accessible. When Trees Testify felt more like an opportunity to talk about how I became the scientist that I am and how I think
Mm,
about my place in the world. I've often been the only Black botanist or Black biochemist in the spaces that I've been. And in many ways, I've thought, what unique lens does that give me? But
mm,
also, I think in some ways, I was spending time myself thinking about having recognized that there were other people in my own family history who were farmers or agriculturalists who had plant knowledge, and feeling like I was part of a generational legacy of
mm.
plant biology, but not knowing as much about that as I would want to for myself. And often my writing starts with an exploration of me trying to know more about the world and then asking, are there ways that I can share what I've learned? Because I'm usually so enthusiastic about it, I want to share it. And because I love to write, sometimes it takes long form, like a
Mhm.
book.
Mhm. Well, I think, like you mentioned, that professor that inspired you, I think that comes through in reading your writing in the book,
Awesome.
your enthusiasm, interest in
Mm.
the subject matter, both your personal experience and what you've uncovered, discovered through writing the book. You know, when I first read the title, it's very intrigued. What does it mean to say that trees testify?
Yeah, so there is a history in the US actually, including with like the National Park Service, of naming some very old trees as witness trees. You'll
Ah,
see some record of witness trees. These might be trees that were standing at the site of a battle, that were standing at the site of some deep cultural or historical
mhm,
event. And so this concept of witness trees has been out there. But for me, I started to think about the fact that there's a distinction between witnessing something and testifying about it, right? You can witness something and just see it, but not bring that test, that witness forward. And when I think about testifying, there are ways in which you think about testifying in the judicial system as a witness bringing forward their experience in
mhm.
service to justice. And so testify for me really gave me a deeper sense of thinking about how I wanted the stories of these trees to come forward and contribute not just to what they had seen, but to contribute to how we think about that and how we want to then wrestle with and grapple with what they've witnessed.
You know, just building on that a little bit, what can living organisms offer that human records can't?
I think one of the things I think about my first experience with this 400 to 600 year old oak tree at a site of a
Mm,
former
mhm,
plantation. And certainly I can read about this tree, I can look at pictures of it, but to actually be there and touch it, the physical sense, to be able to smell the flowers on it, I think that there is a deeper context that you can get from actually being with a physical being and even imagining that other people generations before would have had the opportunity when we're talking about hundreds-year-old trees
mhm,
to be with that same being. So for me, I truly believe in historical context. I've written myself, right? But there is a deeper sense of the touch, the sense, the smell, the shared experience that I think when you get to interact with the living being, than only a recounting of the human experience.
mhm. You know, the book, as we mentioned at the outset, traces America's Black botanical history, legacy through
Yes.
specific species. What plants have you covered?
So, first of all, I want to say that I want to acknowledge that this is primarily the United States of America, right? There's a larger America Black botanical legacy, but you can only put so much in a title. But the trees that I have covered, there's 7 species of trees and also the cotton shrub. So I cover oak, poplar, mulberry, sycamore. Um, what am I forgetting?
Willow.
Apple and willow, yes. And then for me, it was impossible for me to write a book about trees and the Black American experience without acknowledging the presence of cotton because of also my family's own connection. But apart from that, there is a ecological connection between cotton and trees in that a large part of the Southeast was deforested to make space to grow cotton. So there's also this ecological connection that goes beyond my family's connection to cotton as well.
You know, continuing with the discussion on the specific trees covered, what does examining Black history through those trees reveal that more traditional historical lenses often miss?
I think there's several things. I will say that my own impetus for really exploring that was that I think we need multiple lenses into whatever we're interested in history
Mhm.
because people are attracted to it from multiple different lenses. And so for me, this was a way I thought to present a lens that's been underexplored compared to some. But also, when you look at the ways in which trees have been interconnected with the experience, particularly of African Americans who were enslaved in the US. You know, I talk about in the book how many of them actually had to deforest land to make space
Mm.
for agricultural. So their lives were intertwined with these trees. But trees have also been tied to the Black experience from the trauma of trees, including poplar being tied to lynching of African Americans. But then there's ways in which, you know, I go through the book all the way to them being linked to the pursuit of freedom in terms of apple trees. And so I think there's so many different ways in which trees have interfaced with the African American experience that once I started to see that, I thought this is a perfect area for me to explore in terms of my own history in the US, but also my fascination with plant science and the expertise to talk about some of the specific biology of many of the trees and cotton that are included in the book.
You know, you mentioned it, we can go through a number of them, but you mentioned the poplar and connected to the profound trauma
Yes.
that was experienced. How did you approach that and other related chapters with care and intention?
You know, I think part of my hope was that we can do something that I found very helpful in my own life is that we have to be able to hold two things as true simultaneously. That there has been a trauma associated with lynching, which is deeply connected with poplar in this country. And yet, even in the midst of that trauma, people continue to thrive and make families and to find joy. And so I try to both acknowledge the trauma, which I think we sometimes struggle with in the United States, which is holding this kind of history that is traumatic for us to think about allowing to happen, but to also say that in the midst of that trauma, there were things that happened. People continued to pursue freedom. People
Mhm.
continued to be in collective. And so I really wanted to hold all of that and ask how we are enriched when we are able to address the full spectrum of our history.
Mhm. You know, and at the same time, you emphasize joy and sustenance, like Harriet Tubman's apple
Yes.
trees.
Yes.
Why was that balance essential for you?
I think it was so important. I was just recently hearing a little snippet from the late poet Nikki Giovanni, and she talked about how, despite everything that enslaved Africans went through, even in the midst of that enslavement, they found joy. They would cultivate family, they would cultivate cooking, they would cultivate all of these things. And so for me, I find it important that we're able to hold the fullness of that. Too frequently in the US, we focus only on the trauma that
Mhm.
enslaved or formerly enslaved African Americans have engaged. And I know my life to be full of both challenge and joy. And so it was
Mhm.
important for me that we be able to see the fullness, the multiplicity of people. All humans have multiple aspects to themselves. And I really wanted to be able to engage in acknowledging the joy, acknowledging the agency. You know, I think a lot about the fact that I am able to have the career that I have, the privilege that I have, because ancestors were able to endure the trauma, but to do so while holding on to their full humanity, which includes joy.
No, it's a wonderful balance that you've
Thank
achieved.
you.
You know, as a biochemist, plant scientist,
Mhm.
how did you balance, speaking of balance, that scientific rigor with the narrative and personal reflection? I mean, that intertwining was just fascinating and so masterful.
Thank you so much. I think I have always used stories as a way to try to engage people. The human nature loves a story, right? There's nothing more than a little group of 5-year-olds sitting in circle time for a story. And I don't think we lose that throughout our life. I will say that in trying to get it right in the book, it's been really important to me for all of the writing that I've done that if I have plant science colleagues, they can pick it up and say, yes, she got the plant science right. I
Yeah.
want the plant science to be, I'm a science communicator, right? So I'm trying to communicate correctly about that. But I also know that the power of storytelling is important. And in particular, in this book, the stories about my own experience or family, I wanted to bring the history into the current moment, right? To recognize that this is a history that's still impacting. So I would be fully transparent to say that when my agent and I were looking at where we wanted to place this book. We were looking for an editor who would be able to really help me make sure that I had braided them together in a
Mhm.
thoughtful and authentic way. So I worked with an editor, Retha Powers, who her background has been actually in fiction and non-narrative fiction. And so she
Ah,
has a real strength in storytelling. And I know as we were going through writing the book, there would be times where she said, I want to hear more about this. And in the book, I talk a lot about my sister best friend Renee and my son Nicholas. And Retha would say, these characters, her mind is thinking about the
yeah.
stories. And I'm like, they are definitely characters. I know them personally. But it's really about even the writing of the book, though it's my book, my story, my voice. The collective was able to help me cultivate it in the way that I wanted to, in terms of really braiding together all of those, the personal, the scientific, and the history.
Sort of another example of the importance of community for you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes.
How do you hope the book expands the public's understanding of what scientific storytelling can look like?
I think one of the things that I have loved about braiding together science and storytelling is that sometimes a scientific fact will take the public by surprise. And
Mm.
that's how I feel being a scientist, right? So I will never forget standing at this McLeod Oak saying to my, just offhand, because I study photosynthesis, the carbon dioxide we exhale becomes a part of the wood of the tree. And my sister and son were speechless, which is in and of itself remarkable for them to both be speechless at the same time. But my sister said, oh my goodness, this is like mind blowing. And so I think sometimes the science allows us to understand our personal experience in a way that goes beyond the current moment, which I am always looking for that invitation because I think we live in a space where we are so much focused on the current moment and ourselves that anytime we can be reminded that we're a part of a longer generational experience on the planet. And there's some fascinating science that can help us understand that, but that's connected to people. And I'm always trying to find that intersection and ask, how can I share that in an accessible way that can get people to kind of rethink how they're thinking about the planet?
Connected to that, we mentioned how community is central to how you go about the world. How
Yeah.
did that belief shape the book?
It's shaped the book in terms of it was very clear to me I didn't only want my personal story. So there is a
Mm.
through line in the book about how I became a botanist, right? From the time I
Mhm.
was doing experiments with apple seeds as a child. But I also deeply wanted to acknowledge my fuller family's experience. So able to highlight stories about my maternal grandfather that I became aware of in the Willow chapter
Yeah.
and throughout the book, right, you see family showing up, my son, my sister, my mom, best friends. And so it was also a chance for me to acknowledge and celebrate my family as a whole. Because I always say, I think Toni Morrison has said it before, but I show up as a single person, but there's a whole group that's showing up with me, whether you see them or not. So it was important from that context, but also the ways in which I tried to explore. You talked about Harriet Tubman and the Apple story. So many people know Harriet Tubman, the freedom woman. And so to be able to also say, how can my knowledge give us a fuller view of others as well?
Mhm, mhm. What do you hope readers carry with them after finishing the book, perhaps emotionally or intellectually?
First of all, I'm always hoping that when people finish reading a book of mine that's about plants, that they're more interested in the plants in their environment, that they're interested in the trees in their yard, that they want to go and re-engage with them. But I also think, in particular, with When Trees Testify, I hope readers will walk away with a refascination with African American history and what it's contributed to this country. We live in a time where we're actively erasing, trying to erase our
Yeah.
acknowledgement of history. And, I've spoken about my mom. My mom is in the early stages of memory loss. And so I'm understanding that biology can erase memory, which is a something we don't have a lot of control over, and thinking of the absurdity of us intentionally erasing, parts of trying to erase parts of history. And I hope when you look at the stories that are there, the readers that look at the stories that are there about me or my family, they understand that that history impacts the way we show up in the world every day. And while I say it's America's Black botanical legacy, it's actually America's legacy. And so I hope people will be refascinated with the plants in the present space, but also how they've been a part of the American project for a very long time.
No, well, your book definitely achieved that with me, as I mentioned briefly before we started recording the program, found myself looking up different cultural events that I
Mm,
hadn't been aware of, such as the Elaine Massacre,
yes,
and finding out so much more to just inform my historical background knowledge. Some authors or authors' works that you cite that have me going to the library wanting to
I love that.
find out more. So it's definitely something you've notably achieved.
Thank you.
What's been some of the reaction and feedback you've heard from any number of the constituencies, the
Mhm.
general public, maybe colleagues in the field?
Yes. Yeah,
Please.
it's been fascinating. I've received some emails I worked at Michigan State for almost 20 years, and I received some emails. A couple of my colleagues said, one of the trees that you mentioned, the sycamore, I was actually in that campus at Oxford, Ohio, never knew that story, right? And so
Ah,
people are seeing specific places that they were. It's been a lot of fun as well. I've been getting pictures. A friend of mine sent me a picture of a 100-year-old tree in her parents' yard. She said, we've never really kind of thought about it. I've heard beautiful stories of how people planted trees in their yards and would sit with them, and now they're like, I breathe more intentionally, kind of knowing that my presence will exist on in this tree. So I've heard so many different perspectives, and that's one of the great gifts of writing. You write because you feel compelled to write, and then it invites this entire engagement that for me is a gift because I love community and it allows me to build community and learn more.
mentioned a couple of colleagues or others. For readers who have a beloved tree in their own lives, what do you hope this book invites them to notice or remember?
I hope two parallel things. I hope that it will, if they don't know a lot about what kind of tree it is and what kind of life that tree has, I hope they will be engaged to learn more about that. Um, but I also hope that it would cause them to think if that tree predated them, to think who else lived with this tree? What was their
Hmm.
experience? But if it's a tree, I planted a tree with my son when he was 1, so it's his tree. We've known this tree his
Ah,
entire life. And times I think when we read the book, I hope it causes him to think back to his life with that tree, and what he's experienced. So I think a lot about that. What can we learn about the trees themselves, but also the people with whom they were in community?
after listening to what trees have taught you through this project, how has your own relationship with the natural world changed or evolved?
In the past 10 years since I've been writing books in particular and noticing even more things around me because of the ways I want to tell stories about them, I am often having to, if I have a meeting, I have to schedule an extra 15 or 20 minutes. I am often taking time to stop and observe so much more than I used to. When I showed up here at Harvard Radcliffe, they have a history with apple trees, and there's
Oh,
an apple tree on the yard. So I've been watching it each season. I came kind of towards the end of summer. And so I also love to watch the trees in my space and see how they're changing over time. So I spend a lot more time. I'm like back to being 5 years old. I'm distracted by every tree and flower and have to stop and spend some time with it.
You know, when you look back from the beginning, when you had the idea to the book, to now that it's out and being enjoyed and celebrated, what are some of your reactions to this whole process and where it's taken you?
It has really further cemented my kind of belief that you have to follow your instincts. Because I remember when I first started talking about writing this, someone said to me, "You're not a historian. How's that going to go? And what are you really going to tell personal stories? Because I know you're private and you don't like to share anything." And my instinct said that the magic was at the center of the science, the history, and making it personal. And so I really learned to trust my instincts. And I think a lot of times we talk ourselves out of doing things that no one's done before or seems out of the box. And sometimes those are the very things we need to do.
Mhm. You know, after you have to leave Disneyland at Harvard this
Yes.
year, what are some upcoming plans and projects you have in mind?
Well, first of all, I think they're going to have to evict me. I hope you don't see me on the news being evicted. No, I've had a great experience here and been working with a couple of students thinking about my next work that I'm working on. And I'm looking at some work. A lot of our really impactful Black feminist writers and thinkers, Octavia Butler, Nikki Giovanni, Jamaica Kincaid, have some powerful things to say about plants and trees. And I'm really looking at what we can learn from looking at the ways in which they engage with the natural world. So I'm eventually supposed to go back to teaching, but while I'm teaching, we may be pursuing some of that in the classroom. And I have plans to go out to California and see some of the things that Octavia Butler documented in her journal. So the pursuit of plants will continue.
That's huge. Yeah, just curious, as we're coming to the end, when you say the pursuit of plants, how about yourself? Do you keep a number of plants? And you mentioned the
I do.
plant, the tree that you have for your son, with your son.
Yes. Yeah, so that's been one of the hardest parts this year is that I
Mhm.
had to gift and let people babysit my plants. And so every time I'm back home, I'm visiting them. I do keep a lot of house plants. My mother kept a lot of house plants. I have at times done a lot of gardening. I moved from Michigan a couple years ago, which had to reset my gardening, but I do love to grow plants. There's nothing like cultivating a plant and seeing a new leaf or a flower. It's just beautiful.
Mhm. Beronda, in closing, how can viewers and others keep in touch, perhaps find out more
Yes.
about what you're being involved with now and in the future?
Absolutely. So I am engaged in several social media spaces. The easiest way to figure out where I am is to just go to my website, berondamontgomery.com. It has links to my Instagram, my Blue Sky, and often I am posting blog posts and talking about what fascinates me. So that's the easiest place, berondamontgomery.com.
Okay, we'll be sure to have that in the closing credits.
Thank you.
But unfortunately, Miranda, we've come to the end of the program. Want to thank you again so much for taking the time to be here, giving us wonderful background information about when trees testify. Highly recommend it, and want to wish you continued success with future endeavors.
Thank you so very much. It was fascinating, and I've greatly enjoyed talking to you.
Also want to thank those of you watching for joining us and hope you'll be able to tune in next time.